The topic today is the is-ought dichotomy, as Ayn Rand calls it, or the is-ought gap, or the is-ought problem, as a lot of contemporary philosophers call it. And we want to specifically talk about how Christian morality relates to this issue. So how does God relate to morality, especially in light of the is-ought gap? And then how does Rand's morality relate to this issue? It's kind of a big topic in ethics, especially contemporary ethics, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, especially if you've run into presuppositionalists who really, really want to insist that the is-ought gap must be followed, and therefore we have to appeal to some sort of divine command theory for God's existence. So, but that gets into a little bit of the weeds. So let's back up and do a big picture overview of what exactly is the is-ought problem or the is-ought gap. David Hume is famous for introducing it, and he actually introduces it in sort of a weird, convoluted way. It's not exactly his presentation of it isn't exactly the same as contemporary versions of it, and the contemporary versions of it I think are a little bit cleaner. So we'll focus on that. Basically, the is-ought problem or the is-ought gap says from any number of is statements, you can't derive an ought statement. And this is speaking basically purely logical. So think of it as if you have a syllogism, or a series of syllogisms. If all you have are premises that state X is Y, Y is Z, Z is A, etc., at no point in that will you be able to derive an ought. At some point, basically, you have to insert an ought in the premise in order to derive an ought in the conclusion. So first of all, I'll ask Cody, does that make sense? And while you're thinking about that, and tell me your thoughts on that real fast, I'm going to message Robert here.
Yeah, I understand the way it's posed, and I understand, to flesh it out a little bit. I think a really easy illustration is somebody says you ought to brush your teeth, and then you ask, okay, well, why ought you to? And you could come up with a number of reasons, but those reasons would have reasons behind them, and those would have reasons behind them. Just to illustrate, brush your teeth so that they don't fall out, so that you can have a good appearance and eat food and enjoy it. But why do you want to have a good appearance or eat food and enjoy it? Well, because if you could enjoy your food, then, well, that's a major joy that's missing in your life. Joy is a value. Okay, so then why ought you to have joy? Or you chase it back down, and eventually it does come down to a decision that you want to seek values in the first place. If you didn't have that decision to seek values in the first place, it would be hard to get started.
Yeah, and so and that line of thinking is going to lead us, or is going to be how this relates to Ayn Rand's ethics. But the contemporary pushback on that in general is going to be, okay, well then what we don't have is a universal or categorical oughtness, or a categorical imperative, so to speak. What we have are sort of instrumental oughts. You ought to do this if you want this. And another way that it's said is it's a hypothetical, meaning it starts with if rather than is. And so there's a certain sense in which I agree with Cody, and a certain sense in which I think that there's a little bit of legitimacy to this sort of objection, in that it's right. In syllogisms, in logic, you can't have purely is statements and derive an ought. Sort of. The trick is, if you can have an is statement about the nature of goodness, and since ought pertains to goodness, ought basically means it would be good to do this. That's one way to do it, and I think that's the way that some people are going to try to get around the is-ought dichotomy. And in fact, that's the way that I would lean toward myself. And we'll get into that a little bit more here in a minute. But that's the logic of it. Basically, you either have to go the hypothetical route where you insert an if into your syllogism, and the if then generates the ought. If you want to do X, then you ought to, or if you want to accomplish X or achieve X value, then you ought to do A, B, C. That's one way to generate an ought. The other way to possibly generate an ought, and this right now I'm just speaking sort of hypothetically or theoretically, is if you can give a description for what goodness is, then you've got an is statement that by virtue of the relationship between oughtness and goodness, you can generate an ought. So those are sort of two different approaches. Although it's important to notice that most people reject both of those approaches today. Most contemporary philosophers, including Christian philosophers, are going to basically accept the is-ought dichotomy and sort of posit that, either morality is completely arbitrary, and we have to just posit arbitrary postulates that we go by, or morality is completely subjective, whether it's subjective on the person or subjective on the culture. Or some people are going to say that there's no such thing as morality. There's something called error theory, where they think that moral statements are sort of the equivalent of computer errors, where they don't say anything meaningful about reality. And then there's going to be the Christian appeal is going to be to divine command theory, which says, well, God provides the ought through his commands. And that gets us to the issue of the Euthyphro dilemma. And I don't know if this is something that everyone is very familiar with. Most likely you are at least vaguely familiar with it. It's from Plato's Dialogues, and he's recording a conversation that Socrates has with a young guy on the way to taking his father or father-in-law, I forget which, to court. And he's asking about what is the nature of justice, what's the nature of goodness, and eventually they get to the idea that goodness is what all the gods agree on. So Socrates is sort of asking the guy, how do you know what good is? What's your standard of goodness? And he says, well, it's what all the gods agree on. And then Socrates asks the question, is it good because the gods agree on it? Or do the gods agree on it because it's good? And for our Christian monotheistic context, we can change that to singular God. Is what's good or just good and just because God agrees with it, because God declares it good and just? Or is it good and just apart from God, and God sort of bows the knee to it or conforms to it? So the idea is either you have God sort of arbitrarily creating goodness via command or fiat, or the other horn is you have a standard of goodness or justice that exists sort of eternally apart from God and even above God, and he conforms to it. And both horns of that dilemma are supposed to be unattractive for the Christian, in particular, other religions as well, but we're talking about Christianity here. And I think most people are going to side toward the arbitrary horn. Most Christians are, because what they really, really don't want is something that God bows the knee to. Like that's just like, then you're really compromising the nature of God and the sovereignty of God, the independence of God. And so that's like the really, really unattractive option. So if we're going to have to choose one, then most Christians are going to side with the arbitrary option, where they're going to say, all right, well, I guess God just sort of arbitrarily commands these things. But they know that sounds bad. They don't want to say it's arbitrary. So they're going to come up with a way to say, well, no, it's not arbitrary. It's reflective of his nature. So rather than saying that, well, God could have declared that it's moral to rape someone every Tuesday. That God couldn't have done that because that would contradict his nature. So then his nature is sort of the grounding of goodness or morality. But what I want to point out is that means that you're grounding oughtness in isness. You're grounding what's good in the nature of God. And I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think that's what we really want to go for here. What we want to do with the is-ought dichotomy is resolve it. Because if we really accept it on like a universal scale, then we have to say that there's no relationship between what is and what ought to be. That there's no correlation. That reality doesn't determine morality. That morality is like this alien thing that comes in from outside of reality and sets terms for us inside of reality. And that just doesn't make much sense. There's nothing outside of reality. So morality has to be integrated somehow with reality. Oughtness has to be integrated somehow with isness. That's what we should be after here. And so I think it's a good instinct to want to ground to resolve the Euthyphro dilemma in God's nature. But I think too often we stop short there. And so that this isn't a monologue, I'm going to ask Cody if you've got any thoughts on that. And I'm going to see because I think Robert is going to join in here in a minute. So.
Oh, good. All right. Yeah, I'm taking careful notes. I love the way that you've laid out the issues because, first of all, it's just a matter of making sure that we're clear on what is the question that we're asking. You're asking how can we show that morality is integrated with reality? Or another way that we hear from Ayn Rand is morality objective? Are moral concepts or a moral code demonstrable by pointing to facts that we can observe?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's going to get to there are sort of two different issues here. There's the epistemological angle and the metaphysical angle. So the epistemological angle is going to emphasize how do we determine what is good or bad? How do we figure out in a rational, objective, justifiable way what counts as good and what doesn't? That's going to be the epistemological aspect. The metaphysical aspect is going to be what is the nature of goodness and how does it square with the rest of reality? Is there actually such a thing as goodness? Is there actually such a thing as a good state of affairs or a bad state of affairs? And like I said earlier, that there are some people who call themselves error theorists who believe that no, there is no such thing. Moral language is just a useful fiction, or a way for us to emote. When we say that what Hitler did was evil, what we're really saying is boo on Hitler. I don't like Hitler. So that they want to say that there's no such thing as moral reality. That there's we're not referring to anything when we make moral statements. And of course, if we're not going to be error theorists, and we shouldn't want to be, then there's going to be some nature to morality. That there's going to be something that some way that it interacts with or is integrated with the rest of reality, and that's going to be the metaphysical aspect. And so, and those two issues are tightly linked, but it's helpful to understand that they are two separate issues, or at least two separate aspects of the same issue of morality. So I want to move on real quickly, unless you had something else right there, Cody.
Go ahead.
Okay. I want to move on to why it's not enough for us to simply ground morality in the nature of God and then just kind of be done with it. And that is because if that's all we have to say about it, it still seems like we're appealing to some sort of divine command theory. It seems like there's still the possibility for the arbitrary, because it seems like we're still saying, well, it could have been in God's nature to want us to rape every Tuesday or something like that, or want us to murder. Murder could have been in the nature of God, and so if what we mean by goodness is just whatever God's character is, we still haven't said much, because we haven't given any content to God's character or to what we mean by goodness. And so what I want to say is we need to have a concept of what goodness means. Like we need to identify what is the nature of goodness. It needs to have a nature and a content in and of itself, in order for us to make any meaningful statements about God's character grounding it, or about it being a reflection of God's character. It has to mean something.
If we don't have a specific meaning for it, then the default is that goodness just is an exact synonym of godliness. That all it means is that it's however God is. Yeah. Which brings up the question, if you're talking to an atheist and you say, well, God is good and we should seek God and we should seek what is good, and he, from his perspective, if he hasn't already accepted that the definition of goodness is godliness, or what God is, then he's thinking, it could have been anything, and all you're doing is saying basically something totally empty. You're saying, let's say I made up a word, I don't know, it's really hard to make up a word on the spot, but let's just say the word is
God is fluberous.
Fluberous, okay. Yeah, God is fluberous. Well, what's the definition of fluberous? Oh, it's how God is. And you're telling me that I should be fluberous and that I should want to be around this fluberous God? Why? Well, because he's fluberous. That's how empty it would be.
Exactly. So, and the reason that this works and goes undetected is because we all have sort of an implicit assumption of what goodness is, of what the nature of goodness is. We just don't talk about it. When we talk about it explicitly, we say it's whatever God's character is. But what we really mean is, I've got this idea of goodness, and it includes X, Y, Z character traits or X, Y, Z virtues, and I'm attributing that to God and saying that that's part and parcel of God's nature. And so what I want to say is, let's bring out those implicit things and make them explicit, and then test it objectively and find out, okay, what does it mean to say that something is good, that God is good? Because if we're not able to give a objective nature to what goodness means, then, like Cody said, it's meaningless to say that God is good. And Christians shouldn't want that to be meaningless. We should be complimenting God when we say that God is good. Just like love, we have a general understanding of what love means, but that doesn't mean that we're detracting from God's nature. Imagine if someone said, if you gave a definition of love as caring for someone else so much that they become more important to you than your own life, especially if we're talking about like romantic love. Say someone gave that definition and then someone else said, no. The Bible says God is love, so love is whatever God does. Don't bring in your pagan notions of love. We should just hold to the biblical definition of love, and the biblical definition of love is God is love, period. Like, that's silly. That's stupid. The whole point of saying that God is love is that we have certain objective content that we mean when we're talking about love, and we're attributing that to God in order to compliment him, in order to talk about how wonderful he is.
In order for somebody who is not a believer in God to become a believer in God, I think that it's important that they actually would confess that God is good. So there has to be the ability for somebody who is not yet a believer in God to understand what it means to be good, and then to attribute that to God.
Yeah. So hopefully you see why it's important that we don't merely ground goodness in God. I think metaphysically speaking, it's good to say that what goodness is something that is ultimately characterized by God's nature and God's character. but we have to unpack that and say more about goodness in particular, because love is ultimately a picture of God's nature, and logic is ultimately a picture of God's nature, and so is wrath and justice and every other attribute. But that doesn't mean that those attributes are all meaningless. That they each pick out a certain aspect about God that we need to give content to in order for it to be meaningful. And we seem to be okay with doing that with every other attribute of God. We don't seem very good at doing that with goodness. And I think part of the reason is we really like the moral argument for the existence of God. And the moral argument for the existence of God needs us to leave the concept of goodness vacuous so that God can fill it. And that's why I think the moral argument is actually kind of dangerous, because it ends up relying on a sort of arbitrariness or divine command theory or something along those lines that really ends up skewing what it is to say that God is good. But that's a somewhat different topic that we can talk about another time. So moving on to Rand's approach to the is-ought dichotomy. Like Cody talked about earlier, Rand's ultimate answer is going to be to suggest sort of the hypothetical approach. And I don't think she would have explicitly called it that, but that's what it's called in literature today. And some of her followers, I think Greg Salmieri and a few others, have called it that. There's a really good this book. I don't know if you can see it there. It's Metaethics, Egoism, and Virtue by Galtef and Lennox. This is all about Rand's philosophy of egoism and interacting with contemporary philosophers. There's also the Blackwell Companion to Ayn Rand, written or edited by Alan Galtef and Greg Salmieri. This is also a really great resource, and there's a lot of good stuff in here on Rand's morality. And in fact, in here, Salmieri talks about how Rand had begun work on something that I think she wanted to publish, or an article or something, where she wanted to ground goodness in isness, sort of the way that we would ground it in God. She wanted to ground it in existence, and basically say that that by the nature of what man is, he ought to be a virtuous egoist or a rational egoist. And he kind of explains that she ended up scrapping that idea, and he doesn't go into a whole lot of detail as to why. But she ended up opting for this what's called hypothetical approach, where you're not saying by the nature of what man is, he ought to do X, Y, Z. You're saying in virtue of the fact that man wants to live, in virtue of the fact that you want to live, you ought to do X, Y, Z. Meaning, essentially, that morality doesn't apply apart from the choice to live. But let me back up and just fill that out real quickly. So Rand, her if isn't arbitrary. She's grounding it in the most fundamental if possible, if you will, and that is if you want to live, because life is the only possible standard of value for making decisions. And so she's grounding it in the rock bottom, as she sees it. If you want to live, then you must live in this way, and there's no other way to live. And so if you want to live, you will be contradicting that choice by living in any other way than that prescribed by her ethics. And I think she's absolutely right on that. And that's part of the value of her philosophy. She goes so deep to the root, and because of that, she's able to her philosophy is able to encapsulate so much of life. Cody, you had something that you wanted to pipe in on, I think?
Rand quotes the Spanish proverb, God said, take what you want and pay for it.
Yes.
Which, so in Rand's view, and that's a really good summary because there's two parts to it. One is that you have to choose. that you want to live, and the other is if you make that choice, then all of these things follow.
Yep. And part of the beauty is that built into that is the idea that you can't contradict reality in your choices. At least if you want to live. Life, the living in accordance with reality is necessary to life. And I think that's something that we should absolutely embrace about Rand's philosophy. And that is one of the main reasons that we should really, really want to just decimate this whole notion of the is-ought dichotomy, because it assumes that life and reality have nothing to do with each other. It assumes that the way you live your life, it assumes that the nature of reality has no bearing on the way you live your life or the way that you ought to live your life. It creates a dichotomy between reality, what is, and morality, the living of your life. And that's very destructive, as you see in a lot of Rand's fiction. And so we should want to say, no. That there's no fundamental contradictions in reality. That there's no contradiction between reality and morality. There's no contradiction between the way the world is and the way I ought to live. And if there was, that would seem to imply that there are contradictions in reality, and that's something that we should really, really fight against. Do you have anything to say on that, Cody?
It brings up the dichotomy between what is moral and what is practical.
Yep, exactly.
I think that if you think there's a disconnect, then you're going to think that the requirements of reality, that would be the practical side of things.
Yep. And
you're going to think that your moral code may or may not be practical for you.
Yeah, that's exactly how this cashes out in our contemporary dichotomizing between morality and practicality. Which also works out in theoretical and practical, because usually morality is thought of in terms of theoretical ideals. You're an idealist, versus being practical, living according to the real world, quote unquote. So this has massive implications in our day-to-day life, in our moral discussions, in our cultural discussions, in our political discussions. So this is a really big deal. And unfortunately, there's a lot of Christians who aren't able to see why it's a big deal, and they end up making a lot of really horrible mistakes intellectually and morally because of it. Now, let's examine Rand's approach to this. So I've said what I think is really great about Rand's approach in terms of showing that life is integrated with reality, and that if we want to live, it shouldn't be thought of as contradicting or not tracking with reality in any way, that life and reality should be seen as tracking each other perfectly. But I think that there's a slight problem with it, and this is where Cody and I might have a disagreement, and so we can maybe hash this out for the video, and that might be kind of fun too. The issue is whether or not morality applies before or prior to the choice to live. So if we're going to ground morality in this hypothetical, in this if, and say, if you want to live, then morality says, do all of this. Well, the question then is, well, what if you don't want to live? Does morality apply to you? And there are a couple of different answers to that in the objectivist literature. Some people have argued, and I can't remember the name of the gentleman off the top of my head, but there's one objectivist scholar in particular who has argued that Rand didn't actually ground her morality in the hypothetical, that she actually did apply moral principles to people who don't want to live. And his big thing is like James Taggart. James Taggart doesn't want to live, but he's still really immoral. And so what you can do is you can take that and you can either say, well, there's a way to make sense of hypothetically grounded morality that is able to speak about James Taggart in the ways that Rand talked about him. So you can side with the hypothetical viewpoint and try to make sense of moral talk about people who don't want to live, or you can go the other direction, which is the direction this guy was going, where you say no, Rand didn't actually hold to that hypothetical viewpoint, because that hypothetical viewpoint is inconsistent with talking about people like James Taggart in that way. And so, and in that case, then you're trying to explain, well, what did Rand really mean when she sounded like she was talking about this hypothetical viewpoint, but you're claiming that she didn't actually mean that. So first of all, does that make sense, the sort of lay of the land?
Yeah, that does make sense.
And I'm actually not going to side with either one of those positions. I don't think there's much. I don't think the gentleman who was arguing that Rand didn't actually mean to ground morality in the hypothetical, I don't think he has much of an argument. I think from the context and the way that Rand was so very explicit, and the way that Peikoff has been so very explicit on it, I don't think that there's much of an argument to be made to reinterpret Rand as not meaning to ground morality in the hypothetical. I think he's got good intentions, because he's trying to sort of save her from what he sees as a really bad consequence of that view. So I don't think he's being vicious or malicious at all in arguing for that. And he's got some decent arguments, but I don't think that they, in the end of the day, hold much weight. And so I'm definitely not going to agree with him on what Rand's view was. So I think Salmieri and others are right that Rand's view really was grounding morality in the hypothetical at the end of the day. That's what she settled on. That's what she explicitly wrote about. That's what Peikoff explicitly writes about. So I think that is her position.
I agree with that assessment.
Yeah, I assumed you would. But I am going to say I think that it's problematic. And that's where I'm going to potentially disagree with other objectivists on the side of those who interpret Rand as taking the hypothetical route. I think a lot of them are going to say that it's not that problematic, but there's quite a bit of literature on this issue in Rand among objectivists, and there's not a whole lot of consensus on what the solution is to that problem. That there are a number of proposed solutions, but at least from the research that I've done, it doesn't seem like there's a really set agreed upon solution among the different objectivist scholars. So maybe it'll be best now to kind of open it up and see what your thoughts are on that, Cody, and maybe we can just kind of riff on why I think it's a problem, why maybe you think it's not a problem, and kind of explore some of the options.
Sure. The issue first became apparent to me when I was reading The Virtue of Selfishness. I believe it might be in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, but it's in one of those two books. And it's a discussion that Rand gives of why suicide would be immoral. And that's an interesting question, because it's exactly on the topic that we're on. The other place that it came up was in Peikoff's advanced lectures on his book Objectivism: The Philosophy of Ayn Rand, and it's a whole series of lectures. I don't remember which lecture it's in, but it comes up either in maybe it's the Q&A period or something. Okay, what about suicide? And the way Peikoff answers it, and he's already just presented the view, which is the hypothetical view. But so with that as the context, he says, what happens when somebody decides that they don't want to live is they're rejecting all of reality. And he says a moral code, and I'm not quoting him directly, but the concept I believe that he's getting at is that a moral code is guidance on how to exist in reality. So if somebody chooses to not exist in reality, then you can say that they are immoral because they've rejected this system of approaching reality. And they've actually rejected all of reality. They're not just evading one thing, but he would accuse them of evading everything.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I agree in general that that's immoral. I'm not sure that you can say that from the hypothetical standpoint. I'm not sure that you can really call it immoral. You can call it amoral. You can say that because if you're rejecting the entire system of morality, and there's no moral oughtness outside of that system, then it seems like what you're doing is you're really stepping into the amoral rather than the immoral. To say that it's immoral, it seems like you have to be able to say that you ought to accept this system.
So that's really interesting, and that does come up, I think, maybe in... Hey, Sasha.
Sorry.
That's my wife.
Hey.
Just kicking a water bottle across the room. So, the issue that we were looking at, I think that it might be in Gotthelf's book on Ayn Rand, and it might be in one other place. I think that the way that you address it is you say you cannot start by saying why you should accept a moral code. You have to start by saying what is a moral code. Mm-hmm. A moral code is a code for living, given that you're a conceptual, long-range creature that is capable of either flourishing or dying. It's a code that offers guidance. So when we assess somebody that is not seeking to live, it's not that morality does not apply to them because they didn't choose that they wanted to live, but rather it's that I'm having trouble with my train of thought because Sasha walking by.
Let me help you out, because I think I read what you're referring to. Mm-hmm. The idea is those who do accept life and morality can make the moral judgment that that person is bad or evil from the standpoint of what they've accepted.
Mm-hmm. What they're saying is that person's actions and choices are incompatible with the code which they have chosen. With the code which we have chosen.
Okay. Yes. So I wasn't sure what you meant by they there. That was a little bit.
But ambiguous. now I would say though it applies to the other person as well, to the extent that they are somewhat mixed in their premises, because they are seeking life and not seeking life, and so what they're doing is an evasion. And now you could, maybe that raises the question: okay, well, why is evasion wrong? Evasion is only wrong on the premise that life is good.
Yeah, that on the premise that you want to live.
But yes, on the premise that you want to live, and so from the perspective of anybody who has chosen to live, then it is cogent to say that person is not following the principles that I've chosen.
Yes, yeah. So, and this might be a good time to kind of explore the different ways that people have suggested that we deal with this issue, and that might be the most popular one. It's the idea that, well, while it may not be immoral in the strictest sense from the perspective of the person choosing not to live, it is immoral from the perspective of those of us who do want to live. And I think that's somewhat legitimate, or at least I think it's accurate to say, yes, it is immoral from our perspective. Another option that I've heard floated is the idea that to the extent that you're, well, it goes something like this. If you have lived for any significant amount of time, then so say you're like a old child or young adult at least, you've likely experienced this sort of fundamental feeling of joy that is sort of the same thing as feeling your life is valuable. That's something else that I can't remember which author spoke about that, but that was another objectivist who sort of was making that argument, that you can kind of experience your life as almost intrinsically valuable. Now, the objectivist doesn't want to use that terminology, intrinsic, so they want to shy away from that. But that's sort of the idea that they were getting at, is you can sort of have this experience of your life being intrinsically valuable, for lack of a better phrase, and so the desire not to want to live would be in contradiction to that more fundamental experience that you've had. So those are sort of two popular ways to go about answering this problem. And one of the critiques against the first one, the one that you were suggesting, Cody, is that it's sort of an externalist vision of morality. So in epistemology, there's the whole debate between internalism and externalism. And externalism says basically you're justified if you meet these external criteria, regardless of your perspective. So the believer's perspective doesn't matter in epistemology. What matters is sort of the epistemologist's perspective from the outside, where we can, like, I can look at you as the believer and say that you've met these conditions, therefore you're justified or warranted in your belief. And that's externalism. That's sort of Plantinga's whole project with reformed epistemology and things like that, where I can look at you and say, were you naturally were you functioning according to your design plan? Were you aimed at truth? Did you meet all these external criteria? And it doesn't take into account, or at least it doesn't have to take into account, your perspective. You don't have to be aware of anything there. That's the externalist idea of epistemology. And one of the pushbacks against the solution that you mentioned in this book was that seems like an externalist approach to morality, where we say, well, yeah, it's immoral from our perspective, but it's not immoral from his perspective. And then you're sort of making morality perspectival, and it seems to be somewhat problematic. I don't want to go.
I wouldn't say that. Like, that's not my position. Is that it's not moral or immoral from someone else's perspective.
Okay,
so it's a little bit different than that. I would say that they have not accepted the responsibility of living and having a moral code, and so that therefore they are immoral.
But
why should they be moral? That's an invalid question. The question is, if you want to live.
Mm-hmm. But so can they judge from their own perspective that they are immoral if they haven't chosen to live?
They can. If it depends on what you take the word moral to mean, but on the premise that Rand has, that it's hypothetical, they can judge that their actions don't accord with a life-affirming code.
Mm-hmm.
And they can also judge that if part of them is acting as if they want to act on a life-affirming code, and part of them is not acting that way, then there is an inconsistency. And then they have the responsibility to judge whether inconsistency and death are something that they want. But it always keeps going back to that if.
Yeah. And the problem from the other side is going to be, what if they don't want to live? What if they actually are, to a certain degree, death worshippers, who just want to see the world burn?
So when I say that person is evil, what I'm saying is that they are outside of the set of principles which I've determined are useful to seeking my life. Mm-hmm. And which anybody would have to determine are useful for seeking their own life. So that's just objective. Now, I think that it's only on the premise that morality is something other than a hypothetical that begins to look like it's not cohesive,
problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure. If we accept the hypothetical, the only problem that I'm going to pinpoint right now is on the hypothetical viewpoint, granting everything that you just said, that from our perspective and from what it means to live, and the only way that you can live morally, etc., it still seems like, from his perspective, the person who is a death worshiper or a nihilist, from his perspective, he's not evil, or at least he's amoral. He doesn't have to apply moral concepts to himself. And the reason that can be problematic is because it sounds like then he doesn't know that he's guilty. And in a certain way, he's not culpable in his own person. He might be culpable before us, but he's not culpable to his own soul. He doesn't bear any responsibility to himself to act differently, or to think differently, or feel differently, or desire differently. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does raise a lot of questions because one angle on it is responsibility and self-responsibility. And if somebody has not accepted responsibility, then they would not necessarily care if you confronted them with that fact. They wouldn't take responsibility for the fact that they didn't take responsibility, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So then, but then, I still do see that anybody that is seeking anything, even if it's just cheap thrills or being a bully toward other people, or they enjoy hurting other people or something, the fact that they're seeking joy tells me that there is enough of a value orientation in them that they are not 100% black. It's black and white.
Yeah, and so and that gets into that second argument that I mentioned, where if you're seeking any good, most likely it's because you have experienced your life as sort of this fundamental value, mm-hmm. and your evil inclinations, your desire not to live, etc., are sort of contradicting that.
Yeah, and
that's sort of the other way to address this problem or this dilemma. And I think that's a little bit more plausible than simply than at least exclusively talking about perspectives, because, like I said, I think the perspective talk can become problematic. But if you're going to add in this talk about experiencing your life as a fundamental value to the extent that you're mixed, which I think everybody is to some degree or other, that becomes a little bit more plausible. I think there are further ways to push on that, where I think you might be able to push it all the way to get to a more quote unquote intrinsicist viewpoint, where morality is grounded in reality rather than in a hypothetical. But I'll leave that aside for now. And then now I just want to kind of back up and ask, all right, so why is it that Rand is dedicated to this hypothetical rather than to grounding it in grounding it in an if rather than an is, the way that she kind of originally started out? And as Salieri points out, I think part of it is because of her opposition to what she and objectivists in general call intrinsicism. If we ground morality in like isness, if we do that, then we have to do what I said that I was leaning towards at the beginning, where we have this idea that goodness is some intrinsic feature of reality, where you can just say, this state of affairs is intrinsically good. My proposal, and this is a very rough and working proposal that I really got to do a lot more work on, but my proposal is something along the lines of life. Human life, specifically your own life, is intrinsically valuable, and that coincides with reality being intrinsically valuable, because the reality of your human nature is that you have a telos, an end, which consists of you living and flourishing the way that you ought to. So that's how I ground oughtness or goodness in reality, is through teleology, and our nature being such that we're designed to live and to flourish, and that's how the oughtness or the goodness is generated. So that's the way that I would want to approach this issue. But the objectivist is going to call that intrinsicism, and there are a couple reasons why objectivists don't want to go that route. They want to avoid what they call intrinsicism. And so there's two major reasons why. So I want to address those just so that we're all aware of what those issues are, and then be thinking, all right, well, if we're going to go this route, as Christians who value Rand's philosophy, if we're going to go this route of trying to ground it in reality rather than in the hypothetical, in an is rather than an if we do want to go this route, then there are a couple things we really need to be aware of as we interact with objectivists on this issue, because they're leery of doing that for these reasons. So the two issues are, one's epistemological, and the other one, I guess you could say, is sort of practical. So the epistemological issue is, if morality is if goodness is intrinsic, then it seems like the way to discover it is going to involve some form of mysticism, right? And the reason that Rand thought that is because that's the way that most people, including I think Aristotle even, treated intrinsic attributes, like goodness, almost as if the only way to know about them is through intuition, through some sort of mystical experience. Whether it might be intuition, like I can't shake the feeling that this is good, or revelation. God says this is good. Some form of supernatural mysticism is required in Rand's mind and in the objectivist mind in order to objectively identify what's good. And what they're going to say is, well, that's not objective at all. That there's nothing objective about a mystical experience. And so that's going to be one of the main reasons that they reject the idea of intrinsic value. The other main reason is in their minds, if value is intrinsic, then it's not related to the valuer. So the state of affairs that's intrinsically valuable is valuable whether I participate in it in the right way or not. And the problem there is going to be that something along the lines of communism. So there's an intrinsically valuable state of affairs where everybody has the right amount of property, or equality, or whatever you might posit as the intrinsically valuable state of affairs. And the ends are always going to justify the means in getting there because it's intrinsically valuable. First of all, does that make sense? Oh, I think you turned your mic off, Cody. Your mic's not working.
Is it on now?
Yes.
Okay. That's consistent with the way I've seen Peikoff discuss the issue, especially in regard to, like you said, social issues and the use of force. Because
Absolutely.
The point that he brings up is that if you initiate force in order to compel somebody else to do something that you think is in their own good, then you've invalidated their own ability to think through it, choose it for themselves. And that would be true for making somebody be in a career that they didn't choose themselves, or stealing from one person and giving to another. What you've done is taken the human mind part out of the equation and reduced the other person to functioning as an animal in the case of socialism, or as somebody not completely self-directing in the case of, say, compelling your young child to go to school and study this or that in college and get a career as a lawyer, or doctor, or whatever. So the point Peikoff raises is that value is an aspect of reality in relation to man, and man being a conceptual being, it has to be in relation to man's ability to conceptualize that it is a value and to choose it for himself. So yeah, I can see that concern, and I think that you can see how that relates back to the whole if issue, which is Peikoff and Rand want to respect each individual's ability to make that choice for themselves, that they will seek values. And so the way I look at values is, and I think the way that Rand and Peikoff do, is that there is an aspect of it which pertains to what are the facts outside of me, and there's an aspect of it that pertains to, and I have chosen those facts, and it's a combined thing.
Yes. Yeah. So here's the thing. I agree with that, and I agree with the concern that they have about talking about things being intrinsically valuable, that might lead to us divorcing the valuable thing from the way that we obtain it. And so, like I said, there's a real danger there. Just like there's a danger in treating the intrinsically valuable in a mystical fashion, as when we're talking about epistemology, when we're talking about practicality and actually achieving it, there's a tendency to think because it's intrinsically valuable, therefore it doesn't matter how we obtain it. The ends will justify the means, or we don't have to worry about the relational aspect between ourselves and that which is intrinsically valuable, because we don't matter. Just that which is intrinsically valuable does matter. right? So these are legitimate concerns that the objectivists have and that Rand had. And I think these two concerns are part of the main reason that Rand switched her focus from wanting to avoid a hypothetical to endorsing the hypothetical grounding of morality. And so in a way, I applaud her for doing that, because I don't think that she was aware of any way to avoid these two concerns apart from doing that. And so her morality really would have not been able to flourish as well as it does if she hadn't made that move. However, I want to suggest that those two concerns don't necessarily follow from accepting an intrinsic value theory. I want to say we can avoid the problems of the hypothetical option and embrace sort of an intrinsic good or intrinsic value option, and still avoid those two worries, the epistemological worry and the practical worry. And I'm just going to real quickly suggest how I think that's possible, because we're kind of coming up to the end of our session here. But we can talk about this more in the future, guys. We can make this, a whole topic, just this one issue, if you want in the future. And then maybe if you want, you can request that I write articles on this. And Cody, after I brush on these two, I want to get your feedback, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. So my proposed solution to these two, I'll do the epistemology first, is just because something is intrinsically valuable doesn't mean that the only way to discover that value is through intuition or revelation or some form of mysticism. We can insist and agree with Rand that the way to discover it, the only way to discover it, is through reason. Especially, just a second, Robert. I'm sorry. I know you just messaged me asking if the call ended. I'm gonna have to sort of just lie to you and say that it has, because we're wrapping up. But we love you. So let me get back to it. We can say that those things are discoverable through reason because they're integrated with reality. And this is going to lead into my answer to the practical objection. If what's good is intrinsic to reality, and if there are no contradictions in reality, then we can come to the issue of goodness, even intrinsic goodness, with the strong conviction that it's not going to contradict anything else in reality, that it's going to track with reality, that it's going to be integrated with reality. And if that's the case, then it's going to be discoverable by reason, just like everything else in reality is. So that's the epistemological worry. Then that leads into the practical worry, because, like I said, if it's intrinsically valuable, if it's intrinsic to reality and it's integrated with reality, and if you and I are part of reality, then it can't contradict our nature and the way that we go about achieving the good. You see, just because something is intrinsically valuable doesn't mean that you can conform to it in any way you please. One of the things that's intrinsically valuable is the way that you embrace that which is intrinsically valuable. So let's just say there's an object of value that the state of affairs that you need to achieve, but it's also intrinsically valuable that you achieve those state of affairs in a particular way, and it's intrinsically evil for you to achieve those affairs in a way that doesn't accord with them, that doesn't accord with the rest of reality, that doesn't accord with the way that we're built as human beings. So I'll kind of leave it there and ask Cody, what are your thoughts on that real quickly, and we can kind of wrap it up.
Cool. All right. So I think that what you just described is a successful defense against the criticisms that you named. In other words, while I don't agree with you on the using the word intrinsic, I do think that that you've shown that there's so far no objections, at least within the scope of what we discussed today. No objections that would just flat out contradict or disprove the way you're talking about it. Okay, great, and that's the point there. I'm not trying to prove that my theory here about intrinsic value is the right view, or even that it's better than Rand's hypothetical view. All I'm wanting to point out here is
I don't think that the worries that objectivists have about the quote unquote intrinsic view are necessarily things that we have to be worried about. I think there are ways to get around them. More importantly, I think if we're going to take that route, we need to be sure that we do get around those worries in the ways that I've talked about.
Yeah, and this is how knowledge advances, is when we look at what's on the table and we say, well, this is what's at stake on this issue. These are sort of the vulnerabilities on this issue that either we need to sink that ship or we need to patch it up and show how it works. And when I studied Rand's work, it really did shift me from, I think I was, although it wasn't as explicit, I think I was on the same viewpoint that you're describing with the fact that there is such thing as intrinsic value. I think that's for most Christians, I think that's going to be the position. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think most Christians are going to lean in that direction, probably for the bad reasons that we just talked about. That they probably value the intrinsic theory because they think that it entails a mystical epistemology,
and that's what they like.
Yeah, exactly. So they're going to like it for all the wrong reasons, unfortunately. But I think you're right. Most Christians are going to lean in that direction.
I will say, when I was in college, I came up with what I thought was a novel argument. Of course, this is without having read much, but you know how there is the infinite regress argument for what caused what, and that is used to demonstrate God. Well, I thought, well, what about a regression of good things? And so I tried to follow back, kind of like the way David Hume does. I tried to say, well, why is such and such good? And the way I tried to do it was, I said that God is the ultimate good, and that no good could ever exist if God didn't exist. And so I'm only good in a subsidiary way to the bigger picture of the world that God has created, and that the world is only good because it's from God. And so for anything to be good, it has to be good in reference to a previous good or a higher good, something that's more good.
Sure.
And I showed that to a philosophy student that was a friend of mine, and he's like, well, okay, so I understand that this could be the case, but you haven't shown that it is the case.
Yeah.
I was like, dang.
And actually, that's very similar to a lot of medieval views. I can't think of a particular philosopher off the top of my head that specifically talked about goodness in that way, but they certainly talked about being in that way when they talked about a certain type of ontological argument, not Anselm's ontological argument, but there's another type of ontological argument that talks about necessity and contingency. And the medievals saw being and goodness as the same thing, and that's very Augustinian, which I'm going to tend to agree with, because I want to ground goodness in reality, meaning I want to ground goodness in being, being and goodness being virtually the same thing, but having different content to the meanings. But you're right. There's a way to talk about it that says, all right, well, this is how it would make sense, but you're not necessarily proving the reality of it yet, and that's gonna be the challenge there. And I think where Rand is really valuable is that she does the hard work of proving from the if everything else follows, and we shouldn't, like, even if we disagree with the hypothetical view, we shouldn't discount that, like, oh, well, hers is hypothetical, so therefore nothing matters. Well, no, if you agree with her that life is valuable, so for instance, say you're a Christian and you think life is intrinsically valuable, well, then the rest of her morality still follows. The only point of disagreement is you think that it's intrinsically valuable and she doesn't. But if life is valuable, whether it's intrinsically valuable or not intrinsically valuable, the rest of her morality does follow, and she's proved it. And that's where I think the rubber meets the road for us, no matter what position we take in terms of the grounding, the theoretical grounding of morality. I think as long as you count life as valuable, you've got to agree with Rand on the rest.
Even over and above what Rand does to show us her conclusions, another thing that we can do because of her work is she helps us understand what it means to demonstrate something, what it would look like. Yeah.
She does a really great job of of pulling these ideas down from the clouds, so to speak, and helping us to see how to trace them back to reality, how to tie them to reality, so that we can view it as practical for the rest of our lives. So I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Thank you for being my sole audience member today, Cody. Hopefully everybody else enjoys it as they watch the recording. Guys, as you watch this, please feel free to email me with questions or comments or ideas for future hangouts and things like that, and we will do everything we can to make all that happen. Cody, you have any closing words?
No, but thank you for doing this. These are really fascinating topics, and I think that people are going to enjoy this in the future, just thinking through, seeing the process of thought, and hopefully raising a lot of questions that are worth doing the work to answer.
Awesome. I agree. All right. Well, you have a great day. Thanks, guys.